Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Anders Riel Müller. Anders is a researcher and the head of the Smart City Research Network at the University of Stavanger. And through today's podcast we're going to look most closely at the work he did around his PhD and his dissertation. Now this has been published into a series of other articles as well and other parts of his work, which of course is also going to be linked below, but there is also going to be a direct link to his dissertation. Now, of course, we focus on a small fraction of this, but it is a much larger work, and I encourage people to go and read it for themselves. Today, we're going to be speaking about beef and the Korean cattle industry. Now, this has much larger implications of what it might sound like at first glance. It is one of those issues that really begins to tear open larger questions about Korean society, about Korean history, Korean identity, Korean nationalism. It really is a step and a key into so much more about Korea itself. This goes back to deep Korean history, to the origins of beef and cattle on the peninsula, to then the Buddhist impact on this diet, and then the impact of the Mongols. From here we step forward into the Japanese colonial period, and in large ways the re-emergence of the cattle industry, and then how it has stumbled and flourished since, under Sungmun Rhee, under Park Chung-hee, under Chun Doo-hwan, and then into the democratic period. There is a lot of detail here into agriculture, into beef, into farming practices. But at every turn, it speaks to a larger narrative. It speaks to how Koreans see themselves in the world. It runs through the idea of the developmental state, the place that the chaebols have in the country, the impact of the Asian financial crisis, the democratization movement, and how farmers, along with peasant revolt, link themselves to ideas of the past. And then how those ideas of the past have been muddled in and brought to the fore in these extraordinary moments in the early to late 2000s, and this anti-Americanism, large-scale protests across the streets of Korea, a rejection of the world outside, a rebellion against the WTO and free trade and liberalisation, but also a more narrow nationalism, the ideas of the Minjung coming out of the Minjok, and the delicate place that Korean nationalism holds today, just how it survives in a globalised world, and how it is so desperate to cling onto ideas of the past and to build a broader narrative, a broader myth that is just in many ways not there to be found. Now the details of today's podcast I'm going to link below, and I'm going to jump straight into it now because this plays through like a narrative, like a story, and it's one of those things that is fascinating and entertaining. But I do have to give a small caveat. At times in the podcast the audio quality is not the greatest, but it does improve as the podcast continues. It does continue to have its ups and downs, but overall it doesn't affect things too much. And I can't encourage listeners enough to stick with it, because this is one of the most interesting podcasts I've done, and one that digs so deeply into so many aspects of Korea today and Korea in the past. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast directly at the PayPal or the Patreon link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. All the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to talk us through the story of Korean beef, this is Anders Riel Müller. Anders Riel Müller, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we're going to be speaking today about beef and the cattle industry and the deep history about that. Now this, for me, is really interesting. This is one of those issues that I was always interested in. I learned about this even before I really learned about Korea, and I knew just how important this was. And you've done so much work on it. So as I suppose a first question here, let's build this up from the ground like a story. So let's take us back. Throughout your work here, you write that beef has been consumed on the peninsula, the Korean peninsula, for a millennia. But you run through this history of it's there in the nomadic past, and then the Buddhists eradicate it, and then the Mongols come and introduce it in a way. So take us back there to the very origins of beef in Korea.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think my argument is really that beef, the consumption of beef is actually quite a recent phenomenon, especially in the way, to the extent that it is eaten in Korea today. You could argue, of course, that when the Korean peninsula was inhabited by more nomadic people, there would probably be a higher consumption of beef. So that's several millennia back. But with the introduction of agriculture and especially rice production, beef consumption sort of disappears from the Korean diet, and especially during the Buddhist period, from I think it's around 600 AD, around there, you basically stop eating beef because the Buddhist regime discourages any sort of meat consumption. So you have several centuries where meat in general is not eaten very much, and at least not in public. But then with the Mongol invasion, there is indications that beef is reintroduced as a into the Korean diet, and especially after the establishment of the Joseon dynasty, you start to eat beef, but it's still like very, very restricted in the sense that only the wealthiest people, the elite, can eat beef. It's a very expensive food item. So beef never figures heavily in the Korean diet, at least not the mainstream Korean diet. So yeah, you could say like up until almost the end of the 19th century, beef was not a major food source in Korea.
So let's take us up to that 19th century, then, that important period, because you also write here, and this is quite interesting, that you write, and I'll quote, "The first wave of commercial cattle production emerged during Japanese occupation." So what impact did the Japanese colonization of Korea have on the beef industry?
Yeah, well, I think there are two interesting things here. You could say, first of all, with sort of the emergence of sort of a national sovereignty movement in Korea, the idea of Korea as a sovereign nation, you already in the late 19th century has, I think it's the Independence Club that writes in one of the newspapers in the late 19th century that Koreans, in order to become a strong and independent nation, need to change their diet. That a strong nation is characterized also by what people eat, and that the Korean diet of rice and kimchi makes the nation weak. So already in the late 19th century, you have these sort of like Western-oriented independence activists who think of that suggest that instead of eating rice and kimchi, we should eat beef and bread. So this idea, this notion of a modern state, a strong independent state, independent of foreign interest, is heavily dependent on what we eat. That notion is also quite dominant in Japan at the time. So I haven't been able to prove the direct linkages, but I have probably some connection there that the Japanese also encouraged the consumption of beef, especially for their soldiers, to strengthen their fighting spirit and their physical stature. So in the beginning of the 20th century, with the colonization of Korea by the Japanese start to establish more systematic cattle production in Korea, and that is it starts quite slowly, but it's particularly ramped up during the period of fighting in Korea. So there you see a drastic increase in cattle raising in Korea, mostly to supply the Japanese army and the Japanese heartland, or the metropole, if you could say so.
So from there, let's step forward to before Park Chung-hee, let's go to Sangmun-ri and the independence of Korea. And of course, this is one of those moments that really comes across as this stark moment in Korean development, him and then Chung after him. But you write that despite the focus on national development, Sangmun-ri, his interest in agriculture was quite limited, apparently.
Yeah, well, I just want to mention what is quite interesting is like one, and I can't remember his name right now, but a U.S. missionary who was in Korea at the end of World War II. He observed a significant decrease in cattle in Korea from 1945 1945 to 1947. And his assumption is that with the collapse of the Japanese Empire and also widespread hunger, basically a lot of the cattle that was on the Korean Peninsula was actually slaughtered for food. So just a few years later, when Syngman Rhee comes to power, cattle raising is pretty much wiped off. It's not a major activity on the Korean Peninsula at that time. Syngman Rhee is not really interested in agriculture because he is also a modernist, so he thinks of, first of all, of national security, of course, and he has support from the US that supplies agricultural goods to Korea as food aid. So he is more interested in building up military strength and not to build up the agricultural sector in Korea. That is also part of his view of the peasant and rural areas in general. He sees them as backward and sort of impeding Korea from becoming a strong independent nation. So he has very little interest in agriculture, and he can sort of follow that policy because there's enough food aid coming from the US to supply, especially urban areas, with like wheat and canned goods and so on.
So what about Park Chung-hee then? His focus in here. He comes to power, and a similar development focus is on that change in becoming this powerful nation as well. And you write here that he, in some ways, also squeezes this agricultural sector. You say that they some of them, despite coming from rural areas, they all come from these. I suppose in some ways urban and rural areas across Korea, but the focus again gets really narrowed in on heavy industry, and again agriculture gets left behind under Park Chung-hee.
Yeah, in the first period of Park Chung-hee's rule from the early 1960s up until the early 1970s, he can sort of follow the same strategy. He has plenty of food aid coming in from the US, so he is more concerned about building up industrial capacity and military capacity. He does increase rice production quite a bit, but that is mainly to again export rice to Japan. So he sees the rice sector as something, but there is not this idea of agricultural development for national food sector. That doesn't come until the early 1970s, where the US starts they're signaling that they will reduce food aid significantly. And that poses a major problem for Park Chung-hee because he needs to, if he cannot get the food aid cheaply from the US, then he will have to go on to the international markets and buy food. Agricultural commodities in US dollars. So he's very the regime is very concerned about if we have to spend money on buying agricultural commodities from overseas, that will take away money from importing military equipment, industrial goods. So he starts in the 1970s to promote agricultural development, and again it sort of has this two-sided element. That one is that he is starting to lose political support in rural areas. So he needs to, he's starting to lose political support because the rural areas are falling behind economically. And people in rural areas are well aware that people in the cities are living better than they're doing. They have relatives in the cities and so on. So he needs something to sort of ramp up his support in rural areas, and at the same time he needs to increase agricultural production in Korea to prevent South Korea from having to buy food on global commodities. So that is basically like the two motivations behind agriculture.
So let's talk about that re-emergence then, that re-emergence of the cattle farming. So this seems to come about in the mid to late 1970s. So how is it that cattle farming re-emerges, I suppose, with the impetus of the state behind it? So let's go to that period and just what happens there and how is this, what is the change that happens across the landscape?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because it's hard to say I haven't been able to quite say, like, it's a chicken and egg phenomenon. Like, to what extent is it the rise of meat consumption in Korea that drives this? And to what extent is it the sort of part of the agricultural modernization program? But what you can see in the late 1970s is that meat consumption in general goes up quite quickly. And at the same time, you have this national self-sufficiency strategy. So the government is also trying to increase production in the areas where demand is high. So beef growth, it's still like a minor portion of the meat consumption in Korea. I think it's only like less than 10% in the late 1970s of the total meat consumption in Korea. So you do have, especially like, let me just go back a little bit. In the 1960s, you do have like cattle farms in Korea, but they're mostly supplying like luxury hotels, the wealthy elites with beef. So you do have a small amount of cattle production in Korea, but then you have cattle production for meat at least. You start to also have like cattle for dairy in the 60s. But in the 70s, you see like this increase in cattle production also on small farms starting to occur. So what we see in the late 1970s, early 1980s is that a lot of like small farmers, which are the majority of farmers in Korea at the time, they start to, buy one or two heads of cattle and raise them and then sell them to get extra income besides their main activity, which is usually rice production or horticulture, right? So you do have this sort of it actually comes like kind of organically in the beginning. It's not like a major push from the Korean government in the 1970s. It becomes a major push in the 1980s. But in the 70s, it's sort of like it sort of evolves quite organically. Like people, like small farmers, start to raise cattle for additional income.
From that, let's step that into that second stage then, when the government does get more involved, and assume that this has something to do with the I suppose LIDCOR, the Economic Planning Board, and their steps. So you write about how the government begins to get involved, and they begin to do things like they introduce state controls on beef supply, and they introduce things like price management. So I suppose let's go to that period in the early 80s that you mentioned there, and just how significant these type of government policies were and just what they were.
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. So what happens in the early 1980s is that Korea, especially the US and Australia, are pushing Korea to open up the agricultural markets for agricultural imports. And that is something that the Korean government is not very pleased about, because controlling any sort of import of any sort of good is a major part of Korean development policy. Basically, like, we should only import the most necessary stuff, like military equipment and high technology commodities, but the rest we should produce in our own country. But because the push from Australia and the United States is so heavy, Korea agrees to certain measures related to agricultural trade liberalization. So basically, they do accept to import more animal feed, wheat, corn, and so on. But at the same time, the Korean state is trying to really, really control any sort of import-export of agricultural commodities. And that is where LIDCOR comes in that it is set up to regulate, to make sure that Korea doesn't import more beef than absolutely necessary. So they're setting production targets, like how much should we produce inside Korea and how much should we import. And they do this it's a quite interesting and very strict regime as far as I can tell. So they're starting to push and tell Korean farmers, yes, we know that we have opened certain agricultural markets for imported goods, but we will promote the production of beef as a way for you to compensate you. So the Korean government encourages farmers to raise cattle for beef, and they do that. And they do that to quite extensive degree, especially in the first half of the 1980s. So what the government is doing, it's setting production targets and it's supplying cattle to farmers, and so a lot of cattle farmers they take loans from this to buy cattle because the government promises that there will be a market for it. So then the first half of the 1980s, you see a massive increase in cattle production in Korea. The problem is that by the mid-1980s, oversupply of cattle becomes a major problem for Korea. So basically, Korea starts to produce a lot more beef than is actually consumed in the country, and that leads the prices to collapse. So, and that puts a lot of farmers in a very difficult economic situation. Basically, they have borrowed money to raise these cattle. Right?
So as you're speaking there, in my mind, it sounded like there was certain similarities between the way the government developed the beef industry and the way it operates in things like the chaebol, for example. Did you notice similarities there? The idea that we're going to give cheap loans and we're going to promote the industry and put protections around it. Do you notice any kind of similarities between those kind of policies there?
Yes, it follows the same logic, basically. It's so they're trying to push production in what they consider strategically important sectors, right? And I focus particularly on cattle. You could say the cattle industry is quite different from many other agricultural sectors, meat sectors. So like poultry and pork sort of follows the more chaebol path. So in the 1970s, Samsung is given a concession to basically build the first industrial pig farms in Korea. And you have the same with certain chaebols are given concessions to produce chicken. And so there's a little bit of difference in the sense that cattle farming has been more characterized by this, that has been raised on small farms, especially in the 1980s. So, but the logic, the push behind it is the same.
And as we talk about self-sufficiency and nationalism, which is going to be a running theme throughout most of this podcast, we should also talk about systemic breeding. And this is an interesting part that comes through. So you write about where the import of cattle, and you talk about a series of different breeds of cattle that I suppose were not native to Korea at the time, that they begin to bring in during the 70s and 80s. And you say this is quite interesting, that they weren't just importing them to breed them, but they were importing them to crossbreed them. And you're right, the important thing that they're trying to do here was improve the native stock of cattle, as in we're going to improve Korean stock rather than just import and then continue breeding foreign stock.
Yes, and the history behind that is actually that in the 70s, South Korea tried to import, like I think it's Angus and some other cattle races from the US that are sort of bred specifically for meat, right? The Korean native cattle, the one that later becomes known as Hanu, is really it's not meat cattle. It's a draft animal. So it's being used to plow and like work on the farm. So in the 70s, the Korean government tries to import these cattle, and also in the 80s trying to import cattle from overseas and then raise it in Korea. they have quite some serious problems. Like the mortality rate is quite high, and they have a lot of, like, is it the climate? Is it the way that, the conditions on the farms and so on? So what you do have from the 1980s more is more like a targeted breeding program to sort of crossbreed the native cattle race, which is a draft animal, with these like more meat-heavy races like Angus beef or Angus cattle. So it's quite interesting to see, like, if you look at, there's a really interesting report written by the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Research in the late 1970s, where they're looking at the prospects. How can we export more beef to Korea? And the consultants there are basically saying, like, oh, we don't have to worry about Korean cattle because it doesn't produce a lot of meat. It's not they don't believe that Korea will be able to build a significant domestic cattle industry. But over the next 20 years, you basically see the Korean cow, the native cattle race, increase its weight by, I think it's like 75%. So it becomes or 60%. So you have, over a period of 20 years, you have this really specialized breeding programs that sort of creates the cow that we see today in Korea. And so there are some interesting things there about nationalism, because, using the name Hanu to promote Korean beef, of course, indicates some sort of that this is a Korean native race. And you can ask all sorts of questions: to what extent is it native? To what extent has it been crossbred with other cattle breeds? So, but we can get back to later that when we talk more about nationalism. But you do have these very targeted programs to sort of make the Korean cattle, because it is quite accommodated to the climate and to the conditions in Korea, but they're crossbreeding with these other races to increase its meat portion, right? So that's basically what goes on in the 1980s, as well as pushing for the production.
So let's step into another early precursor for what's going to come in some ways, and this is the beef controversies and some of these early farmer struggles in the 1980s, and with I suppose the time that Chun Doo-hwan comes to rule and the assassination of Park Chung-hee. And this is an early precursor of how important the beef circle is going to be in the political movement, and also, I suppose, how they can link themselves to the past and revolutionary struggle. And you write here that Chun Doo-hwan, so that they bring in the National Livestock Cooperative Act, and they have LINCOR, and they have the National Livestock Cooperative Federation here. And a lot of these things are there to, I suppose, improve the lives, improve the working conditions, and improve the industry itself. And yet you write that when Chun Doo-hwan comes to power, he tries to put the top cadres and political people at the tops of these organizations, which begins to create, I suppose, an anti-democratic feel and some unrest. And this has spiraling effects for where the industry is going to go, and where we'll get to a little bit later in the podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting period because what we didn't mention is that under Park Chung-hee, the sort of agricultural modernization programs also are very much, as I said earlier, linked to winning back political support in rural areas. So he establishes what is now well known in Korea, at least, the Semo-Undong movement and organization, which was on the surface an attempt to, or an institution to promote rural development. It was also an attempt to establish what you could call a sort of alternative party structure. So it was heavily controlled by people from the central government, all the way down to the village level. And and it's also through this organization that or affiliated organizations that beef is being introduced. So Samuel Undong also has almost a monopoly on selling cattle to farmers. And then with the surplus of cattle in the mid 1980s, of course, a lot of farmers become very dissatisfied with that the retail price for beef doesn't even cover their cost. So you start to see people who have been trained and mobilized within the Samuel Undong movement as being disillusioned economically with the promises of the government. And so you see, it's a quite interesting thing that goes on in the mid 1980s. My thesis behind it is that because Park Chung-hee and Chun Do-won has built up this very sort of militarized, structured agricultural cooperative. What happens when the leaders of that cooperative becomes dissatisfied with the government? So you actually have they are able to take over these cooperatives, especially with the democratization around 87, 88. So, but that discontent with that the government doesn't deliver on promises in the mid 1980s is really fueling what you could call the first major peasant or agricultural protest in Korea in sort of contemporary history, and they have quite an important role in the pro-democracy movement.
So from that, at that exact period, there's another wonderfully interesting moment here that many people are not recognized, and I, of course, have no memory of. But it's the Olympic Games and that Olympic period just afterwards, and suddenly beef stage at the Olympic Games when bulgogi, which is a Korean beef-based dish, is put up there as a officially designated dish, and it's right next to kimchi, which everyone's aware of kimchi, but not many people are aware of bulgogi outside of Korea. So why was this such an important moment, this Olympic Games? And I suppose the aftermath as well with because some of the aftermath has a lot to do with some of the concerns about liberalization and trade liberalization.
Yeah, it's actually, I think it's quite interesting to study that. I think, of course, people in Korea did eat beef up until, before the Olympics. But what the organizers or the government in general is concerned about is we have all these, especially Western visitors coming to Korea for the Olympics, and we need to identify Korean foods that would cater to sort of their palate and their way of eating, right? So, I'm always joking they could there's no historical argument for why they chose bulgogi as a national dish for the Olympics. Right? It might as well have been kimchi or something else. But the Korean government is, of course, very concerned about people getting a good impression of them coming to Korea. And bulgogi is sort of, it's not too spicy. It's something that looks quite familiar to Western audiences. So they're basically trying to promote foods that have a Korean history, but are, suited for Western palates. That's basically the idea behind it, right?
Yes.
I would have thought it would be interesting if they had promoted Jungkookjang or something, but they didn't. But so here you start to see, I think is really the first time in post World War II history where beef is suddenly considered some sort of a national dish, or a beef dish becomes promoted as a dish. And that is really connected to the Soviet.
So let's step into this period just after there as well. And there's an important moment in the 1980s, and I suppose mid-1980s, where the world is under, I suppose, some degree of economic strain, and there's structural adjustments are happening around the world. GATT, which is, I suppose, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, if I remember my university days correctly, and that's the precursor to the WTO. And everyone suddenly is trying to reduce tariffs around the world as much as possible, so everyone is aligned. And of course, this creates slew of accusations of what is an acceptable tariff, what is a tariff, and what isn't a tariff. And Korea finds themselves in a head-to-head battle with the rest of the world about protecting their beef industry. Often it seems with America and the concerns over what American access can be to the Korean markets.
Mm-hmm. So this political battle over agricultural trade liberalization goes back until the early 1980s, and it's sort of, with the GATT and the WTO comes like these successive waves of political struggles in Korea about to what extent should we protect the agricultural sector from imports and try to balance it out with Korea's obvious interest in exporting industrial goods. So it's an ongoing battle, but Korea in the period from especially the second half of the 1980s is very strongly opposed to any kind of trade liberalization linked to rice and to beef, like meat in general, as much as possible, but especially beef. And of course, that is interesting because there is this sort of discussion in Korea about the Korean government always willing to sacrifice the agricultural sector in order to promote the interest of export-oriented chaebols. But if you look at it, then there are certain agricultural sectors that have been where the Korean government has really tried to keep up tariffs, keep up import restrictions, and that is especially beef and rice, right? Mm-hmm. And my argument is that is because of the political power of especially the rice farmers and the beef farmers, and that goes back to those struggles we talked about in the mid 1980s over. What do you call it? Like the farmers' protest in the 1980s, and in the they become linked to the pro-democracy movement, and then with the liberalization in the late 1980s of also state institutions. So you have the state-controlled national cooperatives that you mentioned before. They are suddenly in the first democratic elections to leadership. They become, instead of becoming the state's control system, control apparatus, it's taken over by some of these pro-democracy aligned farm leaders, or farmers leaders. And so the cooperatives become very, very influential within the Ministry of Agriculture. And the Ministry of Agriculture in this early period of after 1987, 88, they become more aligned with the interest of farmers rather than the interest of the state. So they are pushing heavily to protect the most strategically important agricultural sectors. And they're quite successful actually. And there is like, especially I think its name is Steinberg, who writes in the early 1990s saying like, he thinks that especially the National Livestock Cooperative is probably one of the most formidable political forces in Korea, and they have this strong anti-US sentiment because they see US beef as the main competitor. So they're also able to link that anti-US sentiment to sort of broader currents in the pro-democracy movement.
So let's touch on that here. So one more question before we jump into gastro-nationalism, as you call it, some of the really fundamentally interesting things and some of these explosive issues. And this is another one that I'm going to introduce here because it again, a lot of these things will link to later on when all these protests begin to happen. And one of the ones we haven't spoken about yet is feed and this competitiveness. And of course, for someone who's not a farmer, who's nothing to do with farming like myself, I wouldn't even think of how important it was to source feed. But of course, this is one of those really fundamentally important things of what you feed the cattle and where you get it from and the prices you can acquire it for. And you write here that towards the end of the late 1990s, I suppose at a similar time at the Asian financial crisis, and just afterwards, this crisis of Korean feed for its cattle comes to a head. And this is an issue that many people would be somewhat aware of, because in Korea, one of the concerns is feed from America and the fact that it is GMO, which is genetically modified food. And again, there's huge concerns about that.
Yeah, so basically you could feed, if you talk about food, when you see statistics of food self-sufficiency in Korea, you usually see like numbers around 50%. So basically that 50% of the food that Korea consumes is imported. But if you take a deeper dive into the statistics, it will show you that most of that is not food, it's feed, it's grains that are being imported to feed cattle, pigs, poultry. And that develops slowly in like sort of, I wouldn't say slowly, it develops over time from the 1980s, where you start to increase meat production in Korea. And you, in the 1980s, you actually sort of follow this national self-sufficiency model. So Korea is also trying to develop more like what you can call pasture land and feed crops in Korea, but with the ongoing push with trade liberalization, where Korea concedes, especially on grain trade. You see the cattle sector and other meat sectors in Korea shifting to imported feed. So like especially U.S. corn, U.S. soybean as the main feed component. And so if you look at the statistics, most of the reason why Korea has such a high import dependence on agriculture or on food is it's not food, it's for feed purposes. And so if we talk about the GMO, I think it's quite a bit later, but this link to, it's interesting, when does this like GMO scare show up in Korea? And it does so mostly in a period where there are some very intense trade negotiations around the WTO in the late 1990s. Up until then, you don't really see a discussion about the problem of importing feed from the US. And I think that's quite interesting. So why does it show up in the late 1990s when feed import has been a major activity and sort of the backbone of the entire meat industry in Korea for almost 20 years.
So that's a good launch point for gastro-nationalism, which is a fundamentally interesting thing. Like I said at the start of the podcast, when I first heard about beef in India, in Korea, I heard about the protests and the nationalism behind it, and it seemed strange to me. But this is such a fascinating topic here. So let's jump into gastro-nationalism and just how important it is for Korea. And I suppose we should start with the introduction of the term Minjung. So what exactly is Minjung? What is its origins, its formation, and what does it mean?
Yeah, I think the Minjung movement is quite important to understand the formation of like a national identity, a contemporary national identity around food in Korea. Like up until, and let me just say, I'm not an expert on these different nationalist movements. I think like you already have Vladimir Tikhonov on the
yes.
show, he can explain this much better than I can. But what you do have, like you have the term Minjung, which means, and then you have Minjung, which sort of relates to the common people, right? The like in Greek you have you have demos and oklos, if that makes sense. Demos is the people, oklos are the slaves, those who are outside of the mainstream society. And Minjung is inspired by especially liberation theology that emerges especially in Latin, becomes popular in Latin America in the 1960s. And you have Korean scholars that study in Europe who bring back this idea of liberation theology to Korea. And the main argument here is that Minjung is not, like the people is not the true subject of Korean national identity. Minjung is, that means the peasants, the slaves, those who were not represented or considered in other nationalist movements. So here with the Minjung, you suddenly have the farmer or the peasant going from being in, like under Park Chung-hee, for example, being like a symbol of backwardness, as sort of like the peasant is regarded as everything that's wrong with the Korea when in a time where they're trying to modernize, right? But Minjung positions the peasant as the true spirit of Korean national identity. Those are the ones who fought the Japanese, they were sacrificing their lives, and they have never been recognized. So you have this idea from that sort of becomes even more popularized during the pro-democracy movement in the 1980s, that peasants and farmers represent the true Korean national identity. And of course, that links the discontent of farmers in the 1980s to the pro-democracy movement. And that's where the farmers suddenly become an important symbol of a different kind of Korea. So it becomes an alternative to sort of the mainstream Minjung modernization movement. If that makes sense.
So that is a very interesting point of how it can build from there, because we should mention, you talk about the pro-democracy movement, we should mention the Gwangju uprising specifically here, and just how interesting and how influential Minjung has been for this broader movement here. Because you say it didn't just strengthen and urge students to go out there and embrace farmers and workers, but it also became a starting point for strong anti-American sentiments. Now this is quite an interesting way. This is a step towards militarism and revolution, but also anti-Americanism. So this is, it seems to be a certain fusion between a concern about the importation of American cattle and the challenges that presses, and also that next to the idea that it was America propping up the Chun Doo-won and Park Chung-hee governments.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting how beef becomes central in this debate, right? Because it's, so you have in a pro-democracy, you have this strong anti-American sentiment. U.S. is like Chun Doo-won is basically a puppet of U.S. interests, and then at the same time you have these trade negotiations where the U.S. is trying to push Korea to open up its agricultural markets, right? And especially beef, because the U.S. has, as most people will know, a quite big livestock sector. But so what is, I think this is really the connecting point, is that so the push to sort of liberalize the beef market from the side of the US and of Australia, but that doesn't count so much in this political debate, links the farmers to the student movements. So I say like the students can, or the farmers and the students can agree on, well, you know, the US push to export beef and destroy the lives of farmers in Korea is another example of US imperialism. And so you have, and at the same time you have this idea developing among students that no, it's the true subjects of Korean sovereignty and national identity are the workers and the peasants, right? So it creates this alliance across these two, like the sort of intellectual movements and the farmers and workers movements in Korea, which I think is very important to understand how the pro-democracy movement also develops. And you have at that time then also this movement of students that go into rural areas to mobilize farmers, to train farmers, to some of them also have this back to the land movement that, to become like authentic national subject, you should not be like intellectual, you should rather go back to the countryside and farm, because that is, the essential aspect of what makes Korea Korea. So you have this really interesting political alliances emerging in the 1980s and solidifying in the 1990s.
So on the ground, what were the tactics here? So these farmers embraced Minjung as much as possible. So on the ground, you talk about some remarkable aspects here. There are farmer suicides, a mass slaughter of cattle. So just what were all these tactics across the Korean farming landscape? And just how much did they shock the local population? Because from reading through your research, it seemed to really it was really quite a shocking moment, not just for the citizenry, but also for the government as well.
Yeah, well, I have this point mostly from Jamie Doucette, I think, who was on the program as well. So in the farmers' protest in I think it's mostly in 1985 and 1986, they sort of use a very like you have these like self-immolation attempts that I think I'm not quite sure it's the early 70s, late 60s, but so the Korean farmers in their protest against the drastic drop in cattle prices, they take the cattle onto central squares in major cities, and they basically cut the throat of the cattle, on the central square, and let the blood sort of flow out on the square to show that this collapse in beef prices is killing farmers, right? So you have these images of like dead cattle lying in public squares with blood flowing all over and so on, and of course that has connotations to sort of the sacrifice of the Korean people by corrupt elites and so on. So they're using these very like strong visual tactics that I think Jamie also calls Minjung tactics, and then you also have like these highly publicized farmer suicides, and especially I think the most globally recognized one is the Korean farmer who stabbed himself to death in Cancun at the WTO protest. So you have this, you have this sort of very visual and brutal, or I wouldn't call it brutal, but visual way of that farmers try to show the broader public and the government that your political initiatives are killing us.
So let's move on to a very interesting movement here, and it is Shinto-bori. And this is, I suppose, I'll let you introduce it, but from my reading here, it sounds like almost like a secondary measure. The hope was to ban certain imports, and of course the WTO and the GATT made this impossible. So the secondary solution is to encourage Koreans, despite the imports, to still buy and eat local Korean food, because you're going to support the nationalism of Korea. So it's like a secondary mechanism for nationalism. So I'll get you to introduce that movement as well, but I'll do it with a question. It's a question you put in your writing itself, and it says, how did beef, an unlikely candidate to the status of traditional food given its short history in the diet of the majority of South Koreans, become situated as an authentic food within the broader context of Minjung and the Shinto-bori movements?
It's a good question. And
yes.
I don't think I have the complete answer to that. But as you said, you do have this, I would call it a political compromise, where, okay, the government and the farmers' organizations, they can see that we have to concede on, we have to open certain sectors of certain parts of the agricultural sector to trade liberalization, right? But to compensate for that, the government institutes a range of different support measures to agriculture. Some of them are financial, production support, and so on. But I think the most interesting ones are the ones that are conceptual. So you have these campaigns from the early 1990s that start to promote the idea of we should eat Korean food to protect Korean farmers and to preserve our national identity, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the Shinto Buri movement, which is, run by the National Cultural Cooperative. And Shinto Buri means, you could say it means like body and soul is one. But so basically that what we eat is also who we are. And so because we are Koreans and this idea of ethno nationalism, if we want to eat, or if we want to, be Korean, we have to eat Korean. That is grown in Korean soil. That is what connects us to Korea. So there is this very blood and soil idea going on. And so it's quite interesting to study the Shinto Buri movement and the sort of initiatives that come after that, because you see a significant shift in Korean also dietary advice that up until quite recently, it was, dietary advice suggested you should eat bread, you should eat, you should eat these more westernized foods in order to have a healthy diet. And that changes completely with the Shinto Buri. Suddenly, you have to return back to rice, you have to return back to what people consider proper Korean food that has a long history. But what is interesting here is that my argument is that beef doesn't have a long history in Korea. So how did beef become part of the Shinto Buri? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So how did beef suddenly become part of this movement? And I think that's where a lot of effort has gone into to sort of trying to establish some sort of narrative or myth around Korean or beef being part of a native Korean diet. And you can always question what is a native Korean diet, because it really depends on what time period and all these different conditions that people lived under in different periods. But my argument is very material in the sense that beef was included in this movement because it was a major source of income for farmers. So you need to include beef as a Korean food because farmers are dependent on that income. Then the next step, of course, is to how do you then make beef Korean, because it's been associated with Western diets for most of the past 100 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Yeah, go. So let's jump right on that question. How do you make beef Korean? I think that's important here because you mentioned so this representation of beef in popular media, which I was largely unaware of before I started reading through your work here. And you mentioned these two movies, which I managed to get my hands on to at least one of them, though my Korean isn't great, so I struggled to soak in too much, but the message was there. And you do this analysis of both movies. One is, in translation, The Grand Chef, and the other one translated is Old Partner. And they take different approaches to Korean beef. But I suppose deep down what they're really trying to do is produce two things. Create a deep nationalistic message around beef, of how important it is to beef in the country, but also how important it is to traditional Korea as well. And that seems one of those important messages and how those different steps into building this up. So I'll get you to introduce those two movies here and just what they were and why they were so important.
Yeah, I think I struggled a lot with that question, and I had to sort of look to cultural production to sort of figure out how do you get something that has been associated with Western diet, especially with US diet, to suddenly become part of a sort of Korean national identity. And so when I started my PhD, both the Grand Chef and Old Partner, they come out almost at the same time, around 2008, 2009. One old partner is a documentary. It's an independent documentary, and Chica, the concept is, major commercial production by CJ. So you have these very two different spectrums: the independent documentary and this popular movie. What is interesting is that both those movies are among the most popular in Korea at the time. Like they are huge hits in the cinemas. And that is particularly interesting for an independent documentary to become such a big hit. They have two different approaches to situating the Korean cow as part of Korean identity. So Le Grand Chef is very much focused on sort of what I would call like a Minjung narrative of the people fighting or resisting Japanese colonialism. So the story is that these two the two main characters are competing for the heritage of the last royal chef of the Joseon dynasty, and he with the Japanese colonization, the chef decides to cut off both of his hands so he doesn't have to serve or cook for the governor general. It's a very dramatic story.
Yes.
And so you have these two grandchildren that of his apprentices. The last chef's apprentices has their grandchildren are competing in this national contest to who should inherit the last Joseon chef's knife, I think it is. And so it's really interesting because then you would assume, well, and the cow is always part of this because the main protagonist comes from this poor peasant family. They only have one cow that he treats like this amazing, like almost like his best friend. Mm-hmm. And in the sort of the final competition, they have to cook beef, and he looks around to find like the perfect cow to slaughter for this, and he doesn't find it. And then so he finally decides to slaughter his own cow. And there's this really interesting scene because when he takes the cow to the slaughterhouse, the other main character brings his cow to the slaughterhouse, and you can see the cow is resisting and fighting and so on. But the protagonist's cow doesn't. It just walks in slowly into the slaughterhouse. It turns around. You can see a teardrop falling from its eye. Then it walks in and it's killed. And so there's trying to say like this relationship between the protagonist and his cow is also the relationship between the nation and the people. So the people that is willing to sacrifice themselves for the just cause, which I think is I think you have to see it to sort of understand how it plays out. So the cow comes to symbolize, the self-sacrifice of the people. You could say the other movie, Old Partner, is really about an old farmer and his relationship to his cow that he has had for 40 years. And this cow is not a meat animal. It's one of the old draft animals. But it's like what do you call it? Like a triangular drama between the wife, the husband, and the cow.
Yes.
So there is this very clear dynamic where there's no doubt who is being neglected in that relationship.
Yes.
But it has another story. It sort of follows the story of the Minjung logic. So this is really about the hardship of the peasants in Korea, living in poverty, sacrificing themselves for their children to get a better future. And then the cow in this documentary plays the role of this sort of always loyal partner, follows the farmer no matter where he goes. And so you have this idea of how important this sort of loyal cow is to sort of peasant identities in Korea, and the documentary actually ends up with this is a tribute to the many peasants and the cows that allowed my generation, the director's generation, to go to college and so on. So it's again this like self-sacrifice, but it's not attached to sort of like a dynastic Chosun history, but to the history of the peasant. But both movies are able to situate the cow as a symbol of national identity.
So,
and I'm not claiming that these two movies they're not inventing that idea, but they are representing what has become a dominant narrative in Korea.
So that idea of the cow being placed at the center of Korean nationalism, and of course both those two movies are easily available online. I'll link them in the podcast. I encourage people to go and watch them for themselves. This is a good launch point to talk about America and this moment, these protests. So we built up this history of Korean beef, Hanwoo beef, and the nationalism that was then surrounded into it. And it all seems to be building towards this perfect storm, and that's with these anti-American protests and some of the challenges. And it seems to come across from two forces seem to crash at the same time. One is the discussions about a free trade policy. But perhaps first we should speak about the mad cow scares. So people listening may have some memory of this, but just what exactly was mad cow, and as a disease, and what did it do, and how scary was this for Korean farmers? Because you're right here that there were some cases reported in America in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I think maybe before we go to that, I think maybe we should explain what happens to Hanwoo over the course of the 1990s, because you do have when going back to sort of the free trade discussion debates in the 1990s, Korean the Livestock Corporation and the Ministry of Agriculture starts to develop new standards for Korean beef. And what is interesting about that is that the grading system that you probably know of, A++, and so on, is introduced in the early 1990s as a way for Korean beef to compete against grain-fed U.S. beef. So basically, they're taking the U.S. beef grading standard, which is really focused on fat marbling and fat color, and they're copying that to say, like, well, if we want to compete with U.S. beef, we should emulate U.S. beef quality, because that's what Korean consumers have come to associate with. So by doing that, you also become more dependent on U.S. grain imports, because they need specific kinds of feed to get this very fine fat marbling. You need like special kinds of corn and soybean to increase the fat marbling in the animal. So you have this very interesting dynamic where you're trying to position Korean beef as being authentically Korean, and then at the same time you're copying the quality standards from the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is important to understand what I find interesting about the sort of mad cow controversy in the early 2000s, because when Korea, or when those cases of mad cow disease are discovered in the US, Korea sees that as an opportunity to shut down for US imports right away. And there's arguing, well, we're doing this to protect Korean consumers from eating US beef that is infected with mad cow.
So, how genuine was? So it's a very hard question to ask. So in some ways, some people saw this as an opportunity. In some ways, there must have been a fair amount of fear, of course, at the time. but you're saying that there must have been a certain opportunistic nature to this as well, as this is our excuse to shut it down.
Yeah, and I'm arguing that, and it's not to criticize, shutting down makes sense from a food safety perspective. My question is that even though the Korean government shut down for the import of meat from the U.S., they didn't shut down for the import of feed from the U.S. And what is interesting with mad cow disease, it mostly transfers from animal to animal by through the transmission of like bone meal that goes into. So the proteins are in the bone meal, and that feed was never stopped being imported. So you're basically saying you're stopping the import of meat, but the source of that, the disease, which is the bone meal, is still being imported to Korea at that time. That's why I'm thinking but the U.S., the Korean beef cattle industry is dependent on this feed from the U.S. So there's like an imbalance in sort of the measures taken that I find quite interesting. But they can use this like anti-American sentiment to sort of justify the ban of beef imports from the U.S.
So before we get to the protest, let's talk about the other side of that then, the free trade negotiations and the discussions here. Now, through your work, and you wrote here that the first bilateral free trade agreement that South Korea ever signed was in 2002 with Chile. Now, that sounds incredibly recent to me. I could be wrong about these kinds of things, but it sounds quite recent. You can see this may have been a protected industry for a very long time. And it's about that time in the early 2000s that America and South Korea quite naturally start discussing a free trade agreement. And of course, you're right that the most difficult part of this, the big thing that held it up, was agriculture. And so let's talk about that free trade agreement, just exactly what was trying to be pursued here and why agriculture, I suppose beef, was such a sticking point.
Yeah, again, I think it leads back to actually quite an interesting, there is this sort of dominant narrative that Korea has sacrificed its agricultural sector for the sake of the export-oriented industries in Korea. But when you look at those trade negotiations, you also see that the Korean government, even after sort of abolishing self-sufficiency, like strong self-sufficiency policies, they are protecting certain sectors like rice and beef sectors. And I think it comes down to the political power of Korean farmers, especially those who produce cattle and those who produce rice, because they are able to mobilize very broad political support for their cause. So Korea has perhaps these are the arguments of sort of people who are promoting free trade or trade liberalization, saying the agricultural sector is not important to the Korean economy, so why should we protect something? The economic benefits of liberalizing the agricultural sector would be much higher than protecting it. Nevertheless, the Korean government in successive trade negotiations have tried to really protect certain sectors of agriculture. And that's also why I think if you talk about the Chilean free trade bilateral agreement was a bilateral agreement that could be signed without really stirring up the controversy that the U.S. free trade agreement would, because the U.S. has been pushing mostly for agricultural trade liberalization. So in that sense, you could say the really tough part of making a trade agreement with the U.S. for Korea is this battle of agricultural liberalization. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yes. Yeah. So let's step into that a little bit. So let's step into this moment. I think some of the threads we may not have touched on will perhaps come together as we talk about the protests themselves. So this was this moment that I suppose, in hindsight, you could see it coming, but it must have been a shock at the time, at least by the numbers of people that came out. So in 2008, in protest, and all these fears building up, all this nationalism and this free trade issue building up, there are mass protests in Korea about this. It starts small, of course, and then blows into this huge thing. And from the very outlet, you put a quote here, and this is a very interesting one, because this is a protest about free trade in some ways and fear of American imports. And you write, one journalist wrote on June 10, as the protests were large, talking about President Lee Myung-bak at the time, said he overlooked Korea's nationalistic pride. People felt their pride had been hurt. Now, that is a strange sentiment for many people when they're talking about free trade. They're often concerned about, the destruction of industry, which of course must have been there as well. But it seemed to touch on a much deeper nationalistic impulse.
Yes, and I think that's really, because I started this research with really understanding how these, the 2008 protests could sort of lead to this, could become so big. Like how could this reintroduction of beef imports from the US, how could that generate such a massive reaction from such a broad sector of Korean society? And of course there is this argument that though people were scared of food safety, right? Like the idea, now we will get mad cow disease into the country. I think on a much deeper level, and that's what I'm arguing here, is that this was really about national identity. And I'm not the only one who made that argument, as the journalist also said. But that Lee Myung-bak was willing to sacrifice something so important to national identity as our food, and especially beef, in order to get economic gains from a free trade agreement, by allowing U.S. beef imports to be reintroduced to Korea as part of the free trade negotiation. So what Lee Myung-bak was doing was not just he was betraying, the Korean nation through that. And that's why the protest becomes so large. It becomes about much more about than food safety concerns. It becomes this matter of national identity. And that Lee Myung-bak comes to represent somebody who's willing to sacrifice national sovereignty, national identity, for the sake of economic gains and a free trade agreement with the US. And I think this is really what drives the whole sentiments and the massive protests. So he becomes sort of, positioned as a traitor.
So did he just, in some ways, misunderstand his own Korean, the nationalism in the country around him? Because it seems to me Korea is pinched in this moment here. Because I suppose what can get lost in all of this is exactly why Korea was signing the free trade agreement at all. And this is what I assume was going through Lee Myung-bak's head. And you write here, just remember that what was being ignored through all of this was the strong support for the Korean free trade agreement from Korean corporations. So so those chaebol, the companies that have been so closely associated with Korean nationalism and the growth of Korean development, they all wanted this. And yet on the other side of it was this idea that what was actually happening was going to destroy Korea. So I wonder how you see Lee Myung-bak here. Was he just pinched in the middle of these two movements, or do you think he fundamentally misunderstood the sentiment on the ground?
I think he misunderstood or misread the sentiment on the ground. I don't think he was aware or enough in tune with what, especially the rice and beef parts of the Korean national identity meant to people. I find it interesting. Just going back to that documentary called Old Partner, there's one scene in that movie. It's released in 2009, so the year after the protest. And there is this one scene where the old farmer goes into town on his with his draft and like his cow there, so he pulls him into town, and then he stops in front of the agricultural cooperative, and there's these Korean farmers standing protesting against the free trade agreement and Minjung's opening. And then it says, basically they're saying to protect, to say no to the Korean, to the free trade agreement is also to support the Korean farmers. And I think he truly underestimated the political power that this sort of can generate. And I'm not saying that it will happen all the time, but it does happen. It's happened several times. You have this very strong political mobilization around a few agricultural commodities that are seen as central to Korean identity. What he did do to sort of soften up, especially the resistance from farmers' movements, was that he developed this proposal, or this new strategy called overseas agricultural development. And basically, that was the central government providing cheap loans and funding for Korean companies and farmers to establish overseas grain operations. And so this was, I think, if you look at it from a broader perspective, this was one way of sort of appeasing the agricultural sector to sort of allow him to continue with his free trade negotiations with the US.
So on a last question here, and I suppose you touched on it just a little bit there, the idea of this nationalism around a few key industries and how it keeps emerging from time to time. So we've ended our story here, which is where in 2008, but of course there's lots come under the wood, a lot of water's come under the bridge since then. So how exactly do you see the current landscape of Korean beef and Korean agriculture? Do you still see the same raw nationalistic identity being wrapped around it, or have you sensed a shift in the last few years in a different direction or in any way?
That's a good question. I think it really matters. It depends on timing. What other political currents are going on in Korea at the time. I think it also depends on how would you say, I think that the political power of especially beef producers is being reduced. For example, the whole idea about grain-fed beef as being the best quality is being challenged by environmental concerns, for example. So you do see movements in Korea trying to promote grass-fed beef. So that also challenges sort of the hegemonic status of Hanwha producers. So you see. So I hate to come with predictions. But I think I don't know if they will be able to mobilize, but I think they would be able to mobilize if it's a question about U.S.-Korea relations. I think that is really the second component that is needed. It's this idea that the U.S. is trying to impose restrictions or forcefully open up Korean markets for something that Koreans sees as national identity. And I think it will also happen. It also happens with the Japanese. So it's really also about who is pushing. So when it comes to protecting Korean interest against Japanese and U.S. interest, I think this could be a possible trigger. But in other cases, I don't see it. It's interesting. There's never been this anti-sentiment towards Australian beef, for example. And Australia is a huge exporter of beef to Korea. I think actually has been bigger than the US for quite some time. But you never see this. So it's like, and I think this is something that's interesting about also the movies that I'm analyzing, is that there's this idea of, like, it's that when this beef or rice or something becomes linked to these like anti-colonial, anti-imperialistic narratives, it sort of mobilizes people in certain ways that I find quite interesting.
So that's a great moment to leave this on. So the research that I have based this podcast on is from Anders' PhD dissertation. It's titled "The Making of a Food Security Crisis: Overseas Agricultural Investments and Nationalism in South Korea." I'm not sure if it is available online. If it is, I will link it below. But there's also a series of other articles that I read through and used for this, which I am going to link below, as well as Anders' academic profile. So I encourage people to go on there and read it for themselves. We touched on only 2 chapters here from his PhD, so there's a lot more in there for people to go and listen to and read through. So on that, it's been a great discussion. Thanks a lot, Anders.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been interesting. It's been fun to talk about it.